Hey folks, Darren with Fervent Astronomy. Today we're going to be looking at this, the Sigma 14 to 24mm F2.8 DG-DN lens for Sony E-mount, L-mount, and possibly, whenever you're watching this video, other mirrorless mounts. I am aware I'm not holding the actual lens. I had this lens in and I forgot to film this before I traded it for another lens so that I could do another review. So today we're just gonna go with this. So this lens is the mirrorless successor to Sigma's earlier DG HSM lens that they released for DSLR mounts way back when, and it gives you that common wide angle zoom with a fairly fast aperture. Something that a lot of photographers might find to be good to have in their bag, and since you already have a wide angle lens in your bag, do you need a prime? Well, there's a couple of things that we might want to consider with that, but we'll let the samples speak for themselves. Before we get there, of course, the lens is, while it's a bit bigger than just a prime, it's not overly big. It comes with a built-in pedal hood and the sort of press-on type of lens cap, which is fairly common. It's got velvet flocking around the inside, and you've got the usual things that you would expect. You've got your manual autofocus switch because it is a Sigma lens, and you've got a decent manual focus ring. I didn't find anything especially off-putting about it, and of course the zoom ring. And it's a typical Sigma art lens. Like, it's really well built and it has been well regarded, but is a bit older now, so it'll be interesting to see how this zoom lens performs. So since I don't have it here with me, let's just get right into it. And yeah, Lightroom, go! Hey folks, welcome to Lightroom. Here we've got a collection of samples taken with the Sigma 14 to 24mm F2.8 DG-DN art lens for Sony E-mount, L-mount Alliance, and maybe one day some other mounts, who knows. This lens was released in 2019, as you can see from the suffix here, 019, that's its year of introduction. This lens I had relatively briefly. I've had both this lens and the DSLR lens previously, which have different optical formulas. But for this particular lens, I've foregone tripod static shots. I just have a collection of 60-second tracked exposures at f2.8 at trying to get all of this lens's focal lengths here. Looks like we missed it by 0.6 of a millimeter. Guess I didn't crank it hard enough to the one side there, but in this case, we're just gonna do a nice quick and dirty on the lens and see what the aberrations are like, if any. By the way, speaking of tracking, this lens was tracked on the Fornax Mounts LighTrack II. Fervent Astronomy is Fornax's North American distributor, so if you're interested in learning more about that portable tracker, head on over to ferventastronomy.com. Now, all of these are shot at ISO 320 on the 60 megapixel A7R Mark V from Sony. Why 320 for ISO? Well, this camera is ISO invariant. It has only two quote-unquote real ISO values, one at 100 and one at 320. Every other ISO is digitally faked for the most part, if you want to think of it that way. Basically, if I shoot higher than ISO 320, all the camera is doing is the same thing we can do here in Lightroom and boosting the exposure. By the way, I boosted the exposure by 2 stops on all of these just to give us something more to work with. That means that the camera is boosting nothing real. It's not giving us anything extra to work with. So if I have a 3200 ISO shot taken at 60 seconds at f2.8 next to this 320 shot, I can boost the exposure in the lower ISO shot to match the higher ISO shot and get the same noise, get the same shadow detail, everything the same, except that by shooting at ISO 320, I actually retain potentially some highlights that might be blown out in a higher ISO shot. That, let's say if you're shooting a galaxy core, you know, Andromeda, you might blow it out if you crank your ISO up. Maybe you're shooting Orion, you might crank the ISO up to get a better exposure on, or what seems like a better exposure on the nebulosity, and then blow out the star forming region. And then when you come in and you try and bring that back in post, you can't because there's no information there. Well, if you do what I do, you might get the best of both worlds. So if you want to learn more about that, in the description is a link. It'll bring you back to ferventastronomy.com. Bunch of resources, nice article written by very smart people on ISO invariance, not me, I said smart people. And as well, you'll find a link to these samples, which you can download and pixel peep for days. You can pixel peep all your life if you want to. I just ask you, please use them in good faith for personal use, a personal assessment of the lens. Please do not distribute them online or otherwise. Please don't misrepresent them as your own. Please don't use them as a basis for your own reviews. I'm providing these through my own hard work for you to assess the lens. So please use them in the way that they're being provided and respect my copyright. Thank you so much. Let's pop right in here. 14 millimeters-ish at f2.8, 60-second exposure. Right away, we can see there's a bit of vignetting, which you can also see in the navigator here, and a dark spot in the middle. There's a bit of a dark spot, a donut of brightness, and then in the corners, things are a little bit darker. Very interesting. Let's zoom in to 16 millimeters, and things are about the same. If we zoom in here to 18 millimeters, that darkish spot isn't as prominent, but it is still there. Zoom in more to 20, and it's a little more even across the frame. Still a bit of vignetting. 22, a little more even. And then by 24, we're getting the opposite. We're getting a bright spot in the middle of the frame. Still some vignetting. So that's interesting. As far as contrast goes, I don't think there's any major things to talk about, but let's pop here into the center. We're pretty zoomed out here, so stars are going to appear smallish. And I don't really see any chromatic aberration, no fringing for the most part. Yeah, even on some brighter white stars. Let's come over here. Maybe a little bit of color, a little bit of loss of contrast over here. That's showing that, you know, things like chromatic aberration and spherical aberrations are not a problem. I'm going to pop into the corner. Here we see some weird shapes. This is astigmatism. Some of you might have called this in the past coma. This is not coma. This is astigmatism. And what is happening is the lens is failing to focus light that's from a pinpoint, a star, into a pinpoint along two axes. One would be radii from the center to the edges of the frame. So anywhere that there's one of those stars, it will stretch out on that radii to the center of the frame. That's tangential astigmatism. We also have sagittal astigmatism, which is, it tends to look like it almost is ringing the frame, but it's at a right angle to each of these radii. So every time we have a star like this, tangential astigmatism, we might have, and it's very subtle here, there's almost like little wings. That's sagittal astigmatism. Here we can see that the sagittal is not too bad, the tangential is quite prominent, and that the shape, the manifestation is different as opposed to this corner. Let's check the bottom, changes yet again in the bottom right-hand corner, changes yet again. So there's not an overall great symmetry, but I wouldn't expect it in a zoom lens, to be honest. Let's come over here to the corner, and we're going to flip through the focal lengths. This is 16 millimeters. We'll get a different type of astigmatism or different shape. Here is 18 millimeters, yet a different shape. 20 millimeters, it's got its own unique snowflake. 22 millimeters, a little bit different. 24 millimeters, probably the most compact and least stretched out of the bunch. Let's see. Oh, except in this corner where things are a little bit wonky and different. So I'm going to leave the rest of that for anyone interested to flip through by themselves because it could be exhausting. That does look like there's a bit of, depending on the focal length or the part of the zoom range you're in, maybe a little field curvature where, because we're focused in the center, doesn't necessarily mean we're focused in the corners or edges. I did see at some of the higher focal lengths there, the more zoomed in portions, that we're starting to get a little defocused in the corners, and that's just bound to happen. A zoom lens is a complicated thing. But for the most part, the thing I like to focus on is how do these aberrations manifest when looking at the photo like a normal human being? Are they noticeable? You know, do they make the stars look big? Can you see big streaks? When zoomed out, is it mostly hidden? And here, I don't think it's too bad at 14. We zoom in to 20. Here, maybe a little bit more prominent. In this corner, I couldn't tell the difference. It's not too bad. I don't think it's anything to care about. 24, yet again, pretty similar. So overall, I would say that this lens doesn't have any really awful aberrations that can manifest when viewed like a normal photo appreciator, as opposed to this, which is the way like 12 people on the internet look at photos. So who cares about this, in my opinion? I'm worried about this. And I'd be happy to shoot this. Now, keep in mind, this is a 60-second tracked exposure, so there is a lot that's going into that, but there we go. Now, I mentioned that astigmatism, not coma. Just looking around the frame, I don't see any coma. Coma is what happens when a star gets a fuzzy comet tail. Chromatic aberration, coma, comet, that's where the name comes from. And all the bright stars will kind of have it, and they'll all either have the tails pointing towards the center or the edges. And I don't see that manifesting right now. We're going to pop into the develop module. There wasn't really any chromatic aberration to worry about. It says this lens has a built-in profile for chromatic aberration. Maybe this is one of the few that actually works. Usually, you click that button and nothing happens to the stars. If there's any purple fringing, you can, or blue fringing, you can use the dropper here, but we didn't really have that, so I'm not going to worry about it. Profile corrections. All right, so here we're correcting the geometry. It looks like there's a specific sigma L profile, a V1 and a V2, and the V1 is overdoing the vignetting, and the V2 is overdoing the vignetting correction. So just not as bad. Keep in mind, I did boost the exposure by how many stops here? 2 stops before we got into this, but it is over correcting for the vignetting, so you have to tone that down and find a sweet spot. Wide open, there is that dark spot in the middle, which you can more see here in the navigator. That might need a little bit of a radial gradient mask or something like that to really fix. We're not going to be able to easily tweak out all the vignetting here, so keep that in mind. Let's just kind of halfway through the zoom range. We'll do that profile correction again. I mean, at this point, the vignetting is probably the only thing that really needs correction, and here it's overdoing it again. I don't know that it's going to have a separate profile for each focal length, to be honest, so this might be a profile that works well for one focal length along the range. And also keep that in mind when it comes to geometric corrections, because a zoom lens often has both barrel distortion, which it does here at 14mm, but also pin cushion at different parts in the range. It looks like maybe the geometric corrections are focal length specific, which is nice. So here we are at 22mm, and you can see that it's correcting pin cushion distortion. It's pulling the middle of the frame out towards the viewer. And then if we go all the way back to 14, it's got barrel distortion and it's flattening the center away from the viewer. So it does appear to be correcting based on the part of the zoom range, which is nice. It just has no idea what to do with the vignetting, apparently. So keep that in mind. But overall, I think this lens is pretty usable for Astro, and I know people who have used them quite successfully. In fact, the person I got this lens off of took some beautiful photos with it, just wonderful, wonderful photos. So I know it can be used as a good performer. Is it the optimal performer? It's a zoom, it's not a prime. No, it's f2, it's not f1.4. But if you want something that does a lot of different things, I think this is probably a pretty good lens for you. So let's wrap this up. Is this the lens for you? Well, I think it can actually pull some very cromulent double duty as both a wide-angle landscape or perhaps architecture lens and astrophotography lens. No, it's not perfect. It's a zoom lens. It was never going to be perfect, but I have seen some very lovely photos taken with this lens. Obviously, the samples that we looked at are not those lovely photos. And as I think I mentioned in Lightroom, the fellow I got this from did beautiful, beautiful work with it. And you'd never really notice any of the aberrations because you're busy looking at the subject of the photo and appreciating its beauty. So keep that in mind. A lens doesn't need to be perfect for you to make good photos, but you at least have an idea about how this lens performs and if it might be right for you personally. So I hope you found this useful, hope you found this interesting, and hopefully we'll see you next time. I'm Darren, this is Fervent Astronomy. Take care.